Boker Tov, these were the last two words in Hebrew. Welcome to the Dan David Prize Symposium around the prize given in the time dimension, the present time dimension, defending democracy. At the 89-90, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama coined the phrase, the end of history. We now know that he was wrong. History did not end then, but it became the catchphrase around which much of the public discourse of globally took place then and for years to come. 30 years later, another end became a catchphrase, the end of the liberal order. People speak about the attack on the liberal order, the possible end of the liberal order, and of course, a pillar of the liberal order is democracy, and the attack on democracy is a major issue globally, internationally, and locally as well. Needless to say, this was one of the considerations that governed the decision of the Dan David Prize Board to select it as the theme of the prize for 2019, because the prize in the present time dimension is by definition an issue that is on the international agenda at that time. Could be cultural, could be economic, and could be of this nature that concerns the very foundations of society and politics. Michael Ignatieff is one of the two laureates of this prize, and he will be the first speaker in the symposium that we organize. We have 2 hours. We have a very rich program ahead of us. We'll ask each of our panelists to speak for about 15-20 minutes. We'll then ask them to comment on one another, and then we'll open it up to you, members of the audience. I will not spend much time introducing well-recognized individuals. Michael Ignatieff, the laureate of the prize, is the president of the Central European University, and as such, at the very core of a conflict between an authoritarian Hungarian leader or ruler, Prime Minister Orban, and his university, and is highly appreciated around the world for standing up to an authoritarian leader trying to stifle the academic freedom of an important university. But this does not define his career. He's a well-known historian, writer, professor, political leader, journalist, very rich record behind him. He's, of course, Canadian by nationality, but an international figure. And we'll ask Professor Ignatieff to open the symposium. Michael, please.
That's better. Can you hear me at the back? Good, great. It's good to be in Israel. It's good to be among friends, and I mean friends. I've known Yuli Tamir for 25 years. I've known Shlomo for a long time. It's an honor to be here with a distinguished Israeli politician and leader, and Itamar, don't need to say anything about him. He's been a leader for a very long time, and we all admire him. Let me try and one other thing. This is my last occasion as the Dan David Laureate to thank people, and I have thanked many people already, the David family in the front row here who become such good friends. But I want to thank the people at the back, the hardworking women who get me to places on time and find me taxis when I don't know where the hell I am, and all that stuff. I thank you so much. Sorry? Tammy and Sarah, there you go. Thank you. Tammy and Sarah, okay. Let me get right to it. I wanted to do, I think, three things roughly. Talk about the geostrategic context in which the crisis of democracy occurs, then look at, in more detail, the populist revolt in Europe, some of the general drivers of that revolt, and then finally tell you a little bit about Hungary, which is where I live, as a kind of case study. That's what I like to do. If you start at level one, which is the geostrategic context, I'll go lightly over this, but we need to remember it. We are looking at the, I think, inevitable waning of American hegemony, and that's important because from '89 onwards, the leading power in the world was a vibrant democracy, and we are now looking at a new world in which sometime in the 21st century, it seems to me most likely that the hegemon will be a single-party state, China, and that changes a lot. The second thing about that change is that I see to no one, as a Canadian, we live beside him, we know him real well, I see to no one in my love and respect for the American constitutional tradition and for the American democratic tradition. But there are a lot of serious people who say we're looking at the slow and tragic transformation of America from a democracy to a plutocracy. I just put that out there. The immense and distorting power of money in the American political system should concern everybody who, as I do, loves American freedom. So the third element in this geostrategic story is Russia. There was a brief period in the 90s when we thought the old authoritarian regime might make a transition to democracy. We think that is extremely unlikely now. But Russia is not going to be a hegemon, but it can be a very, very effective spoiler. And we are discovering with some alarm that it is a spoiler working inside democratic systems, distorting outcomes, attempting to skew democratic outcomes. And that, you put all this together, America, Russia, China, we're in a new world whose contours, I think, affect the whole debate that we'll have this morning. Let me then switch to the second level, which is the populist revolt in Europe. I think you can't see what's happened to European politics, or possibly politics in every democratic state, without thinking about three epochal events that have happened in the 21st century that have changed the democratic temper everywhere. And the first is 9/11. Mass casualty terrorism, the terrorism of the apocalyptic spectacular. I hardly need to tell an audience in Israel about the long-term destructive impact of terrorism on democracy. It has forced us to change the balance between liberty and order everywhere of necessity. Sometimes we've pushed it too far. Sometimes we're struggling all the time with that. But mass casualty terrorism has created a permanent atmosphere of fear and apprehension in every society, and it puts in salience the key question in politics, which is who will protect me? Fear becomes the driver of politics everywhere, and the question then becomes who will protect me? And when that question is asked, it becomes much easier to say only a strong leader with an authoritative mandate to act. So mass casualty terrorism is number one. It's also bedeviled and poisoned multicultural experiments in countries like Canada and the United States, where the integration of Muslim minorities in our country was going pretty well, and then Islamic fanatics just made it incredibly difficult for our Muslim brothers and citizens, our fellow citizens in Canada, for example, feel under a suspicion which is, in my view, almost always unfounded, but creates a democratic tension which is very difficult for are minorities. So that's mass casualty terrorism. A second factor that I think is extremely important is the financial crisis of 2008. There again, the question became, who will protect me now? I'm a small investor. I have a mortgage. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Suddenly, the bottom falls out of my world. And I think the long-term impact of the financial crisis of 2008 should not be underestimated. I'm an old liberal. I believe that the state is there to protect people. It's to give them, it is there to regulate markets and make sure that some of the great things of capitalism are risk-taking, but some of the bad things about capitalism are the not-so-creative destruction that goes with capitalism as an economic system. And as an old liberal, I believe the state is there to protect people from some of the destructive forces of capitalism. And those forces were on display in 2008, and they scared people. They scared everybody. But they had the effect of, I think, weakening the legitimacy and confidence that people have in the liberal state. Again, the question arose, who will protect me now from this? A third factor, the third factor that's driving the populist revolt, I think, is mass migration. If you were in Budapest, Keleti Station in late August, September 2015, and suddenly 1 million people are coming through your train station, desperate to get to Austria and Germany, it had a galvanic effect right across Europe. People who thought that some immigration is a good thing, some refugee protection is a good thing, got pushed by a phenomenon that again raised the question, who will protect me now? That is, reinforce the salience of borders and migration control right across the world. And when liberals like myself said modern liberal states are rich enough to be generous and take people in, we missed the fear, we missed the deep apprehension that mass migration caused. I say this with some care because I am the son and grandson of refugees. I am totally signed up to generous migration policies and to conformity with the International Refugee Conventions because my family wouldn't have made it to Canada without that set of values. But there's no question that mass migration is a driver of the populist revolt in Europe. These three things, when you add them together, 9/11, mass casualty terrorism, the financial crisis, and mass migration, have transformed the political scene in Europe, led to very strong surges of demands that say two things. Given these three crises, the liberal elites who used to run these places have failed us. They've failed us on three counts. We need a strong man, we need a strong woman. And here's the thing that's happened everywhere, it seems to me, which is the very meaning of democracy has begun to change, begun to shift. Democracy for a liberal like myself is not majority rule alone, it's majority rule and constitutional rights on the other. It is majority rule balanced by constitutional courts, a free media, universities as well. Why universities? Because universities are the place where when the majority says X is true, some boring academic gets up and says, look, I'm sorry, the numbers don't prove out. You know, you think X, but unfortunately when we do the social science on something, it turns out to be Y. That's what universities do, and we need to think of them, in other words, as counter-majoritarian institutions. And God knows universities don't often get it right, but that is their function constitutionally. We're a pillar of democratic freedom. So, but under the pressure of these crises and the change in the geostrategic situation, democracy for most Europeans now means majority rule and not much else. And if you have to get rid of the constitutional limitations on majority rule, so much the better. Fear is driving this, desire for leadership, don't bother me with these courts getting in our way. All that stuff has been very, very strong. Let me look finally at how this plays out in Hungary. Viktor Orban is elected in 2010. He's been in power now for 9 years. Remember that? He's been in power for a long time. And a pattern has accumulated in which, first of all, he rewrites the Constitution. He dismantles the independence of the Supreme Court. I think Israelis should take note of this. I don't want to intervene in your political affairs, but the court has been so weakened that a university like mine effectively has no right of appeal within the Hungarian legal system, whatever. Just notice what that's like. If you run a university, you have no right of appeal within your own legal system. It's a tough situation. The media have been not muzzled by state control. They've been sold so that 80 to 85% of the media in Hungary are controlled by essentially government supporters or by companies favorable to the government, so that you can say what you want about the Orban regime. That is, there is freedom in that sense, but nobody can hear you. The element that I've lived through has been a studied attack on universities. Why universities? They have brought state universities under control of a chancellor system. They have gone after the most distinguished academic institution in Hungary, which is the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, an institution that was founded by a reforming count in the Austro-Hungarian period in the 1850s. They've gone after even that and reduced the freedom of the Academy of Sciences to award scientific funding. So they've taken scientific funding under the direct control of the government. And finally, they've attacked Central European University. I won't tell you our story of woe, but I would add a fourth element to the Hungarian story, which is populism is, I think, a couple of things. It is a redefinition of democracy as majority rule. It is a hostility everywhere towards constitutional guarantees and minority rights. In other words, it's a systematic hostility towards counter-majoritarian institutions. And third, it's the politics of enemies. Given these three crises, mass casualty terrorism, financial crisis, mass migration, it's crucial to blame someone and constantly blame someone. And so you create an enemy and you run a politics of enemies. And a politics of enemies, I said this when I accepted the Dan David Prize on Sunday night. One of the unspoken rules of democratic politics that we don't think about enough, and it's very difficult to practice, is that in formal terms, there are no enemies in the Democratic House. When you face an opponent, you assume they are citizens, they are patriots, you just disagree, right? Populist politics is creating a new kind of mental atmosphere about politics in which the people who oppose you are enemies, who must be destroyed, who must be crushed, who must be broken, who must be called traitors, who must be called betrayers of the country. This style of politics is actually fatal to democratic freedom. The key thing about politics is actually deeply hypocritical, which is you hate their guts, but they are citizens. You don't like anything that's coming out of their mouths, but they're patriots. They fought for their country just the way you did. And this hypocrisy, this necessary hypocrisy in which you act with restraint towards an opponent, is crucial to the very viability of alliance formation, keeping the system on one show. Orban is running a political system whose ultimate risk is that he can't afford to lose an election. because he's created such hatred on the other side that if they ever get into power, they'll put him in jail. This is destabilizing for democratic politics. This is what I worry about. He's created a politics of enemies that's ultimately destructive of the system itself. So to sum up, and I must stop, there's one final question, and I think Israelis need to be aware of, which is that some of you may be asking, how could an Orban happen in Europe? It's the wrong question. The question should be flipped on its head. It's happened in Europe because of Europe. Accession to the European Union has given him 4 billion euros of transfer subsidies from richer economies every year. He uses those subsidies to basically feed his own beast. That is, to feed his own cohort, feed his own regime-dependent social class. So the subsidies help him. The other thing that helps him enormously is Schengen. If you don't like Hungary, you can leave. And so 500 people leave. This is what creates a new dynamic that it ought to concern you, which is that it's not that it's happening in Europe, it's that the institutions of Europe have become an enabling force that reproduces the system. So you have a new political formation, and I'll conclude with this, that does not use police terror. There are no political prisoners in Hungary. If you go to a demonstration, you never get hit over the head with a nightstick. I constantly criticize the government, and I've not been arrested. There may be microphones in my house. I could care less. That is, it's not a system that functions by police terror, and it doesn't need to. It functions by a new mechanism, which we should all, I think, be concerned of. The constant mobilization of the population through propaganda 24/7. The constant cultivation of the enemy who must be defeated, the enemy who we all unite around to fight and defeat, the constant mobilization of nationalist paranoia. These people have mastered the arts of 21st century communication, and this creates what I think is a new regime form, legitimized by democracy. There were elections, but having vitiated the substance of democracy.
Thank you, Michael, for depressing us. I will now call on Professor Shlomo Avineri. Over the last few decades, as I was mentoring younger faculty members at Tel Aviv University who sometimes tend to think about going into public life, politics, policy making, I would always say, look at Shlomo Avineri. Before he became Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, he wrote 2 classics. He dealt with Marx and Hegel, became a celebrated academic, and then he could afford to pursue other interests. And since then, of course, he's been able to combine the two. He remains an active scholar. He's now publishing a new biography of Karl Marx, and we always read him with great interest over the pages of Haaretz as a major voice in the Israeli public discourse. So, Shlomo, please.
Thank you very much. And there's very little I can really add to. Thank you. Thank you, Itamar, for this very generous introduction. There's very little I can add to Michael Ignatieff's characterization of what we see now. So this is an attack on democracy in various forms, which is using some of the theoretical justifications of democracy against democracy itself. It is different from what we have seen in the 20s and 30s in Europe, and it is therefore, in a way, much more problematic. Let me now add 2 aspects. One very briefly. And this is that, as we have seen in the last few days, especially in the Austin case, this kind of right-wing populism neo-authoritarianism is tinged with criminality, and not only in the Austrian case. When you go the countries which have been affected by this phenomenon in the last few years, from the United States, Europe, in our region as well, the criminal elements are part of the phenomenon, and it has to be addressed. But the major issue I'd like to address is going back to the distinction between classical democracy and modern representative democracy. Because we have been in the last century, and especially after 1945, accustomed to the term liberal democracy, we have overlooked the fact that at least in the 19th century, liberals, including people like Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill and others, were a little bit critical of what was then called the democracy. Because in the 19th century, popular sovereignty, which was of course one of the elements of the French Revolution, was used or misused by authoritarian regimes using referenda and plebiscites. The first Napoleon, the third Napoleon, the extension of the franchise in countries like Britain and France and Germany was not introduced by the bourgeois liberal parties, which were afraid of the populist, plebiscitarian, Bonapartist elements of popular sovereignty, but were introduced by conservative politicians like Bismarck and Disraeli for party political reasons. One has to understand it. However, we tend to identify democracy as we know it with liberal democracy because it is different from classical Athenian or Roman democracy, precisely because of what is called representative mediating institutions. What has made modern liberal democracy different from classical democracy, and I'm saying in different words what Michael has said earlier, is that it is not just majoritarian. It has built-in elements which are restraining the majority through mediating institutions, courts, political parties, a free press, the fact that you have constitutional constraints on the way in which elected majorities can use their form. What we do see today, and this has been creeping up on us in the last decade and a half, and perhaps we haven't really always realized how far it is going, that in a way we're going back to direct democracy. But it is direct virtual democracy. You don't have to stand in the rain or in the sun, in the agora or in the forum. You can sit at home and use your mobile and participate in a direct democracy. If a president of the United States has 43 million followers on Twitter, now this is something which liberal democracy has never known, because liberal democracy was based on party politics, on the traditional media, be it print media, radio, also television, and now you have political leaders who can speak directly to the people when the people don't have to really leave their living room and their mobile phones. And we have now a situation in which political parties, which have been a little bit ossified and sometimes also corrupted, are taking a backseat to the direct appeal in the name of democracy to the people. And the leaders can speak as the authentic representatives of the people and use majoritarian democratic theory as legitimizing their direct link to the people and sidetracking and neutralizing the mediating institutions which made liberal democracy a balance between majority rule and the defense of minority or minorities. To this, I do not see at the moment a clear institutional answer. But if we would like to defend or reconstruct liberal democracy, this has to be done through creating institutions that will again mediate the vox populi to the political articulation of elected government through the press, courts, universities, and this is the reason, Michael has mentioned it, why populist authoritarian leaders or governments are attacking the courts, are attacking the free press, are attacking the universities, viewing them as the enemies of the people. We have to find institutional ways of creating modern, social media-oriented mediations between the people and the elected governments. Not very easy, precisely because, as one sees in many cases, the populist authoritarian leaders are very adept at using the political vehicles of democracy in their favor and delegitimizing anything or anybody who tries to put some constraints on majoritarian rule as being anti-democratic, elitist, enemies of the people. The press as the enemy of the people, the left as the enemy of the people. Let me add also something as a citizen of this country. The fact that the present Israeli government, we don't really have a government, we have a transition government, but okay, the present Israeli government, probably the future Israeli government, finds itself in alliance with some of these neo-authoritarian rulers. I leave the United States on the side for the moment, but Poland, Hungary, Putin. And the simple explanation, which makes sense, is in terms of realpolitik, precisely because the leaders of Poland and Hungary support the Israeli government policy regarding the conflict, Palestinians, the two-state solution or the no two-state solution. It is convenient for the present government to find an alliance with those leaders. This is realpolitik, and up to a point, it is understandable, and Israel historically always took help from where it could get. In 1948, it was not only President Truman, but also Stalin. We have to realize this. A small country, relatively weak country, surrounded by enemies, has to take support wherever it can. But there is also something else, and this is the ideological fraternity of the present Israeli government with the authoritarian populist leadership of Hungary and Poland and Russia. I think our Prime Minister feels comfortable with those authoritarian leaders precisely for the reasons that they are using the illegitimacy of all mediating institutions as being anti-democratic, elitist, and perhaps the enemies of the people. So this is not just realpolitik. This is an authoritarian fraternity. And President Rivlin has, not yesterday, but in another speech said that there is no reason, no justification for Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to find alliance with the kind of leadership which is represented by those countries. This reminds me of a very moving and disturbing poem by Heinrich Heine. Let's say a very problematic Jew, if this is right to say. A very small poem, I think 6 lines, called An Edom, to Edom. Edom, Esau, is the Jewish name for the European Gentile, mainly Catholicism. And this is Jacob, the Jew, Israel, speaking to his brother, Esau. And Jacob says to his brother, for centuries, you have tried to vanquish me. You did not succeed, and you will not succeed in the future. But there's one thing which disturbs me very much, that in the fight against you, I will become like you. This is something which we, that Israelis and Jews and Democrats should be very much aware of. That when we look in the mirror, we should not see in the mirror our historical oppressor, us. There's something, this is a historical burden for us. We should.
Thank you, Shlomo. Professor Julie Tamir is the president of the Shankar College. She was for many years a professor of education and political philosophy at Tel Aviv University. Political philosophy she studied at Oxford with Isaiah Berlin. The definitive biography of Isaiah Berlin was written by Michael Ignatieff. Lots of connections. Julie Tamir was also a minister of education in the Ehud Barak government, an important voice in the Israeli public arena on matters both of politics and education and values. And she's our next speaker. Julie, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you to the David family and the Tel Aviv University for hosting me. It's a great honor to be in this panel. Shlomo Avineri was my teacher. Probably because of him I do political theory. I still have a picture of both of us with my daughter, who was then 3 months old, who I breastfed in your class on Hegel. And I thought you'll be very angry, but you came to me.
Hegelian.
Exactly, and you said to me, this is the youngest Hegelian. And she's doing well since then. Michael and I have been really partners for a long, long time, working on similar issues, and Tzipi and I, in a different way, have been fellow travelers, so it's a real pleasure. Let me present a little bit of a different point of view to what we are witnessing right now, partly because I think that it is a bit too easy to disregard some of the mistakes the liberal democratic world did and just blame it on the other. So my attempt is to reflect for a moment about our own faults, which is not something we usually like to do, but probably if we want to offer an alternative, and deep down I'm still sort of a politician, I would like to see not only an intellectual critique, but a solution. I would like to point 3 major concerns that I have with the way we describe the present situation, which obviously I'm not happy with, like all the rest of you. So I'll start with what Itamar mentioned earlier. Probably the biggest theoretical mistake in recent history, that of the end of history. The Fukuyama moment is important because it was the peak of liberal vanity. And the assumption that we've won, all other alternatives are gone, ideological alternatives are gone, forget about religion, forget about nationalism, forget about everything else, because we are here to stay. I think it was a constitutive moment because at that very moment, the liberal world stopped worrying about liberal democracy. And as we all know, political institutions have to work in order to sustain themselves. They have to educate people. They have to retain their power. They have to provide citizens with reasons to adhere to them. But at that moment of victory, people just said, well, you know, it's now all up to the market because we've done our share, we won. What we see now in retrospect, and we have enough of a time frame to start evaluating this process, is the biggest moment of victory, like very often happens, was the beginning of the biggest failure. So liberal democracies basically withdrew from almost everything they did in order to sustain himself, including something we in the university lament a lot, the decline of social and liberal studies. That were, by the way, supported by the state for a reason. For me, it's okay that the state supports the humanities for a reason. But if you think it's all over, then you can allow yourself to forget about it. And when you forget about it, there is no vacuum. I think the second important lesson is nothing remains as it is. And unless you labor and try to change things, things are not going to go your way. The second thing that I want to mention is that what we're witnessing is not only the vanity of, we have won the ideological fight. I need a man. Thank you.
Be good for something.
Yeah, right. Thank you. The second thing is that what this enchantment with ourselves has done is that we have not been looking at what is happening in our own societies. So liberals were really totally swayed by the idea of progress. The world is going to be better. Things are going to be better. We're going to have more of everything. And people will just feel the prosperity and enjoy it. But looking back now, and actually looking back, and this is really disturbing, at data that starts to accumulate at the 80s, a lot of people in the West have not been doing as well as we thought they would or should. And the crisis of the middle classes, I still think Shlomo used to say it in his classes, everybody who teaches democracy says it, there's no strong democracy without a strong middle class. The collapse of the middle classes has been a phenomenon since the 80s. And we were just preaching progress without looking at the facts. Something that we usually, fact-checking is something very popular these days. We were not checking our facts. So it wasn't intentionalized, but it was a great illusion. And this great illusion is one of the reasons for the huge crisis we are seeing now. And I don't have the time to go into it, but it's very closely related to socioeconomic crises, even across Europe. I mean, look at Germany, the divide between East and West. Look at even within towns, even look at Israel. Maps of political affiliations now are class-oriented, and very strongly so. So something has been happening, and we've been overlooking it. Partly, nobody were, and again, going back to Shlomo, nobody was talking about class for a long, long time. People talk about poverty, but talking about poverty is not the same thing as talking about class. 5 years ago, I wanted to write a paper about class and nation, something I'm obsessed with because I've been working on nationalism for many years. So I Googled up, thank God for Google, class and nation. And the only thing that came up was one item. It was BMW nationwide first-class vehicle. That was the only one. So the class discourse, when I was at Oxford, everybody talked about class. Class was the biggest thing around. It was dead. So we have a gap in our thinking that we should somehow relate to. And the last thing, but not the least, is that the liberal enchantment with globalism left the national sphere emptied of progressive forces. And that has been my argument for ages. Sometimes people really liked it, sometimes people overlooked it. I've been consistent in this for many years, saying that without a productive middle, a middle that is able to look at the national demands, the legitimate national demands of nations, we're living this fear to the extreme right. And that is what's happening right now. And we had a brief talk, Michael and I, beforehand. Hungary is certainly going in the wrong direction, and a very dangerous one. But we, for quite a long time, looked at Eastern Europe as if it was Western Europe. We forgot the differences. We forgot the nuances of the new emerging countries in East Europe. We treated them in a way Europe was supposed to be West Germany. But West Germany, and especially Angela Merkel in West Germany, is the exception. She's not the rule. And the biggest mistake Angela Merkel did was thinking she was the rule. And when she announced and I think part of the immigration crisis is not only the immigrants, it's the feeling of many, many countries in Europe, they're losing control because Angela Merkel stands in Berlin and because of her own history, which is fine, certainly fine with us, saying free immigration. And for them, it doesn't work for all sorts of reasons I can't analyze right now. So I would like to summarize by saying the following. If we want to, to win this fight again, and I'll just say in brackets, I just published a book, and I have in it one chapter I really like. It is when you publish a book, then you develop all sorts of emotion to all sorts of chapters. Some you like more, some you like less, but this is a chapter I like. And this chapter reviews the history. It's a very short chapter and a very short book. It reviews the history from 1918 to 2018. And it shows something that I think is important to bear in mind. Every 20 years in this century, we thought the world is going in a different direction. So, in the end of the First World War, we thought there would be world peace. In 1933, we thought fascism is going to conquer the world. In 1988, we thought liberalism is going to win. Nothing is forever. This is the optimistic part of my talk. Nothing is forever. It's within our power to change things. This is why we're political beings. But in order to change things, we have to listen, we have to change our discourse, and we have to do things differently. And if we do that, we stand a chance. Thank you.
Yuli Tamir mentioned that we should have looked more closely at the data in the 1980s, where the starting point of many of the current issues. I'd like to mention a lecture by Robert Reich, who is a professor of economics at Berkeley now, was the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, and you can find on YouTube a lecture in which he traces back the roots of inequality and anger in around 1980. It's a very important turning point. Or you can buy the Piketty book and read 1,000 pages, or whatever you prefer. Our last speaker in this round is Minister Tzipi Livni, a major figure in Israeli public life and politics, both in government and opposition, twice almost Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Justice, and a very thoughtful political leader. Oh, Tzipi. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. It's a privilege to be here today, this morning, with you all. And my possibility after listening to all of you is also to refer to things that were said. But to start in general is that it is clear that the world, the way we know it, basically was established after the horrors of the Second World War. And for more than 70 years, the world succeeded in working together in accordance to a set of values and in cooperation between different states that were based on the same shared values, what we call the free world, basically led by the United States of America. And when it comes to Israel, Israel succeeded for 70 years to keep the values upon them it was established and that are written in the Scroll of Independence, in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, saying in two words, Jewish democratic, and in one sentence, the nation state of the Jewish people with equal rights to all its citizens. Now what's happening now is that the alliances that were built based on these values outside of Israel is being eroded, and the values of the State of Israel are being eroded within Israel. So I'm talking with you this morning not only as a worried citizen of Israel, but also as a worried citizen of the world, basically. Because we see the same slightly different, but basically the same phenomena outside of Israel and within Israel, and these things are connected. Because when red lines are being crossed elsewhere in the world, in this tiny world, these red lines don't exist anymore elsewhere. And basically, there was a reference here to tweets, and we have the same tweets in different languages. We have the same tweets in English and in Hebrew. And it's really the same against the courts, against law enforcement, against the press. It's basically the same. So for many years, when we used an Israeli leader used to come to the States, usually the opening sentence was, the relations are unbreakable, unshakable, based on shared values. And now we should ask ourselves, well, maybe based on the shared values, but what are these values, if any, at all? And I think that we should put this on the table. Now, Professor Avineri was talking about the changes in technology. You were talking about tweets. We need to understand also that it's not only states that are living, or citizens of one state that are living in different world. Each one of us is living in a way in a different world of information. Trust me, after I quit the parliament, I was asked whether we to renew the newspapers, and I said not, because what I have is Twitter. So I decide after whom I'm following. And I follow those reporters that represent what I believe is the truth, the reality, and my values. Now, you can choose completely different set of reporters that you want to follow. So this creates a completely different world. What used to be the same world with different aspects, different understanding, it's now also relate to reality. When we say fake news, it's not only the fake news. It can be real news, but that creates a completely different world, and we need to take this in consideration. Secondly, Yuli, you were talking about faults and mistake. By the way, it's very liberal and leftish things to do, to think about what we have done wrong. I believe that we should I agree that we should understand why this is happening, and to understand the feeling, not the way they think, but the way they feel, that this is something that creates this kind of resent against elites and against different establishment within that creates, or basically that are the base of democracy. Now, I agree that since you raised this terror thing, that it's really frightening. And apparently there's a kind of a clash between our democratic values and the need to fight terror. But in a dramatic, sad way is that terror, global terrorism, is fighting against us because of who we are and because of our values. So if the result is that we are changing or giving up our values, basically they won. And there is one thing that I'm trying to preach for many years now, is that when we are talking about acting against terror, and I believe that when there's a use, we can use military force against terror, of course. But I also believe that democracy was translated into very shallow meaning. Majority rules is one, and I will refer to it as well. But also in global arena, okay, the rights, it's about the right of people to vote. And therefore we can see in two places which are quite effective to us as Israelis, the Palestinian Authority and Lebanon, to designate a terrorist organization that would never accept the values of democracy, abusing the system in order to get power. And for many years, I tried to convince the international community to adapt certain global parameters, saying that democracy is more than just voting. And therefore, everyone who wants to be part of the democratic process needs to choose between bullet or ballot. I mean, if you want to participate in election, fine. But the basic rule in democracy is that the use of force, the monopoly of the use of force is by the government. And you cannot have a democracy with an armed militia, like in Lebanon, living inside the government and outside the government. Or in the Palestinian Authority, you have a legitimate, I don't want to refer to whether it's really democratic or not, but they accept some rules when on the other side, you have designated terrorist organization that according to the NDI that supervised the elections in the Palestinian Authority, they said it was free and fair. How can it be free and fair when terrorist organization is threatening his own people if they would not vote for him? So this is one thing that I would like that we need to take in consideration. The other is, and there was a reference to it, is that people are worried. It's about their home, it's about their money, and it's about the fact that since we have these changes in technology, people are living in uncertainty, not about their own future, but the future of their children. And for the first time, this is an era in which it is clear that next generation would live in a different terms, more problematic than the generation of the parents. And since some of the professions are going to disappear, there's a huge uncertainty and fear. So if I will take a Maslow hierarchy of needs, people are talking about their family, and we are talking about something very vague in this, sitting in the university, talking about values, about democracy, and for them, it's about what is called about mere life. It's about their life, it's about their family, it's about their future. And therefore, it's quite difficult to explain or to convince that what we are talking now, it's life themselves, especially because people were born to this situation. And for them, it's obvious. And what they need to understand is, as we said, it's like oxygen. We don't feel it when it's in the air, but when it's gone, we will be suffocated. Now, talking about mass migration, and I want to refer also, Yuli, you were talking about class, I think that it's mostly about identity. And this is also the clash between globalization and nationalism. Because, and in Hebrew, we have two different words to nationalism. We have לאומיות and לאומנות. And לאומיות is, maybe it's between patriotism and nationalism, maybe. But it's about your identity, and this is part of you. And when you feel that your identity, not as an individual, as a group, you want to be part of a group, part of something. You want to be proud of who we are. And the migration is not just about taking or integrating into work, but it is also about changing the identity of your state, of your society. And this is something that creates fear, and therefore I want to relate to Israel itself. And this is what's happening in Israel. Because what's happening in Israel is that Israel was established as a Jewish democratic state, and there are those, especially the prime minister, that creates a clash between being a Jewish state or being a democracy. And when this is on the table, the Israelis, most of them, and I'm talking about the Jewish majority in Israel, would choose the Jewish identity. More than that, you were talking about when we are looking at the mirror, the average Israeli, when he looks at the mirror, he sees him as the Jew in Europe, as the victim, as the Jewish ghetto. And this is something that unfortunately Israeli politicians are talking about and energizing this and feed this feeling. And we should add to this in Israel also another component, and this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because you were talking about relations between the future Israeli government, the former Israeli government with leaders. It's not only about authoritarian leaders, but also anti-Semitic. but they support Israel when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So let's turn a blind eye to what they represent and have their support on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one thing. And secondly, let's take Netanyahu's sentence from elections, not the last elections on 2015, about the Arabs drove or coming to the polls with left-wing buses financed by European states. So, well, it's not about political opponents, and it's quite difficult to say that all of us are citizens. It's just a debate among us, because when you add the Arabs into this equation, the Arabs are 20% of the Israeli citizens, but they are also representing the enemies. We have the conflict with the Palestinians. We have the conflict with other Arab states that we didn't achieve peace with them yet. Hopefully we would in the future. And therefore, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict infiltrates into the political decision in Israel, not just whether Israel would make peace with the Palestinians or not, but this creates the tension, not to say hatred, between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority. And it's not anymore, a discussion between different citizens, but it is about nationality. It's about the enemy and creating basically a connection. And this horrific sentence was not against the Arab. It was against left wing. But when you connect left with the Arabs and the Arabs are the enemies, so you have the entire picture. And the problem is that there are those, instead of fighting and putting on the table, and now I'm saying something politically, putting on the table a different story. Did you see yesterday Games of Thrones? Okay, anyway, in the end, what they say is that the most important thing is the story. It's the story of a nation, the story of a leader. And in Israel, center-left is hesitating, and this is the understatement, to put our story on the table. And our story is also a matter of our values and what we believe in. And the problem is that, and I see now the beginning of I hope, a kind of maybe trend, a state of mind of demonstrating and doing something, but it is focused just on one thing that threatens Israel as a democracy. And this is the immunity bill, which is really horrific. But this is not the only problem that we are facing. What we are facing in Israel basically is a combination of criminology and ideology. So criminology is the immunity bill. And whether we have a corrupted prime minister who wants to defend itself, this is one thing. But this is not the only thing. Because to this you should add minority, not majority. Those believing in halachic state instead of a Jewish democratic state, and these are the ultra-Orthodox. So for them, equality is unacceptable. And on top of this, another minority that has a huge political power, and this is the national religious believing in greater Israel and annexation of the territories. And for them, the Supreme Court is a problem. So for the corrupted prime minister, the Supreme Court is a problem, because the question whether he can continue being prime minister under indictment, this is something that will come to the court. Then you have those supporting illegal settlements, so for them, Supreme Court is a problem. And then you have the ultra-Orthodox who don't want to go to the army, and the Supreme Court decide that equality in Israel means that they should. So altogether, there's a process of delegitimizing the courts, the law enforcement, and the Supreme Court in the state of Israel. And by focusing just on the immunity, is getting a kind of an easy job, because this is something that you say, okay, this is not left and not right, this is on top of this. but we should put our story on the table and decide that what we believe in. And the role of the importance, the role of the Supreme Court in a democracy. And the problem is that they succeeded in convincing something that the Israeli, I'm talking now about the former Israeli Minister of Justice, saying majority rules as her understanding of democracy. And this is what I hear now. Also, people say, but what do you want? We voted for the parliament, not for the judges. And there are those that are cooperating, and frankly, I feel sorry for the fact that for the first time, the parliament is going to vote for a state controller. Yes. And the government or right wing decided that since being a judge is not legitimate anymore, so also the opposition proposed somebody who's not a former judge. So we are all now into accepting without even noticing. I'm not sure that this is part of a decision, okay, we would cooperate with this. But this is part of a process that I faced basically in politics, that when the government succeed in portraying the opponents as enemies, the opponents themselves feel uneasy to identify with the same values and of what we believe in. So just to summarize here, I believe that we should put on the table here in Israel our story, our vision, our belief, saying what does it mean for us to be a Jewish democratic state and not to try, to hide. And last thing is that basically I heard that now you're writing a book on Karl Marx, as was said. So I want to say that what we need to do is liberals of the world unite. Is that instead of fighting in different parts of the world, in different states, each one of us, and frankly the feeling is it's being lonely in a way. But knowing that we have others in different parts of the world, in different states, those sharing our values and are willing to regain our democratic values, this would hopefully make it easier on us. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go for a second round in the same order that the first round was conducted, and ask each of our panelists to either add something that he or she had not said before, and maybe not have thought that they had the time, or to comment on any of his, her colleagues' statements. So, Michael, we begin with you.
I learned a great deal from my colleagues and friends on this platform, and I'll try and be as brief as I can. Itamar said I was very depressing. I was very depressing. I agree. And I thought there was the elements of hope coming out from other presentations, and I want to align myself with them. I do think a liberal international is kind of a good idea. Each country is different. The national traditions of each country are different, and that's, I think, a point that Yuli has made. I mean, the liberalism of Israel, the liberalism of Canada, the liberalism of Hungarian opposition figures, the liberalism of, it's a broad church at the very least, and each country will want to inflect its defense of values differently. But I do think if you then ask the question, what's the story we want to put on the table in each country? It's a tough story to sell in one way, which is that it's a story that has to say democracy is checks and balances, a free press, free universities, independent courts, and majority rule. We need to get back and just bang the table on that subject. As boring as it is, we need to go out and talk to people about what democracy is and be unapologetic and proud about that achievement, resolder the liberal to liberal democracy, and simply make a point which is that is as old as democratic theory in itself, is do you want a tyranny of the majority? You actually want tyranny? Because if you don't understand how this balance, that's what you'll get. You'll get tyranny, and you won't like it. I mean, I think there's a, this is not a polite discussion. This is a discussion when you can say what you passionately believe. I've lived through what it's like to be in a country where democracy is used to abolish democracy. I hate it. I can't tell you how angry it makes me feel. So a little militant belief in democracy would be a very good thing. I think a second thing that Yuli as always puts her finger on it, never surrender the language of patriotism and national pride to anybody. I mean, especially not in Israel. God Almighty. I know these people being denounced as leftists who fought in trenches for this country. Get up out of the trench and say, give me a break here. Who the hell do you think you are? That it seems to me is a thing that can be done here, because a country that's based on national service and national sacrifice, it's a disgrace to me to have people accused of not being patriotic when many of them have served with distinction in the armed forces of their country. So never cede the patriotic card, never militarize, lest you think I want to militarize this. No, there are all kinds of prides in Israel that don't take the form of military valor, just take the form of loving your poetry, loving your fantastic novelists, loving your fantastic musicians and scientists, loving what you've done in this country since 1948. This is fertile ground, and no person in the center of Israeli politics should ever surrender that ground. I think that's a message I take from Yuli Tamir, and I take it from my own experience as a Canadian. I lived outside of Canada for 30 years, and I spent years with people saying, well, how can you be a Canadian if you lived in another country? I thought, come on, stop this nonsense. I've lived in other countries as many Israelis have lived in other countries. I'm a Canadian all the way down from the top of my head to the tips of my toes. You're stuck with it. If you come from a place, you're stuck with it. The good side, the bad side, you're stuck with it. And I think one of the things that Yuli's work has always shown is that it's possible to have a liberal nationalism that is proudly patriotic and cedes no ground to anybody on that score. I think the tough stuff. So I think there's lots of stand and fight here. I've stood and fought in Budapest as best I could, and I've learned that even though the battle may not be successful, because a little university can't stand up against the state, at the end of the day, they got the cards and you don't. But not all losing battles aren't worth fighting, if you'll allow the double negative. We have substantially raised the price for this regime. They can't go into any public forum anywhere in the world without some bothersome person raising the issue of CEU. And I'm damn proud of that. So it's a story about fighting. It's a story about standing up and being counted. And that's why the recognition from Don David means a lot to me personally, because he got the message. We have stood up and fought. And I think universities in Israel need to stand up and fight and defend their incredible contribution to the public life of Israel, and not let anybody start playing little populist games with the public funding of science and research. And of course, universities are a pain in the backside, and there are always going to be university professors who say things that politicians don't like. Bring it on. Bring it on. That's what universities are for. And we have to defend our unpopular colleagues. And sometimes they say damn stupid things, let's be honest, right? But we have to, academic freedom is a culture of an institution, and we need to be intensely proud of what our institutions do. We should also make very sure that they're not little liberal enclaves. It's extremely important for universities to be genuinely pluralist places. That is, to have places for the religious, for conservatives, for liberals, for socialists, for communists, for anybody who, works within the rules that Tzipi made clear, which is a Democrat is someone who will never use violence in the pursuit of a political aim. And in that house, then a university must have place for everybody. And we must, as university teachers and leaders, demonstrate to our society that we can keep a big pluralist, raw public debate alive as opposed to shut it down and make little universities these liberal covens where we're all crouched in a defensive circle, incanting and repeating our sacred words as the world shrinks around us. That is not the way for universities to perform their role. I think one of the really difficult issues that Ms. Livni raised, because she's been in the combat, is how you maintain a politics of adversaries as opposed to a politics of enemies in a country as divided as Israel is, and where you have minorities whose basic loyalty to the Israeli project is in question, and these minorities come from within your own Jewish family. These are terribly difficult issues. But I would plead as a foreigner, as an outsider, as someone who doesn't know anything but pretty fond of Israel, it's so important to maintain a politics of adversaries, even when it makes you scream at people who will not serve, people who question the right of the state of Israel to exist. All these things push everyone in a democracy to the limit of their tolerance, the limit of their ability to. And I absolutely understand it. I just plead that you never get into a politics of enemies, because in the end, it is conceivable that you could destroy this wonderful experiment itself. And I pray, as a friend and someone who watches this closely, that you never do. So thank you for your attention.
Professor Avineri, please.
Thank you. I'd like to underline two issues or terms which were addressed both by Yuli and also by Tzipi. Class and nation. I think those are very important issues. After the electoral victory of Trump, the New York Times published a review of its own coverage of social issues. And it turned out that when they're dealing with poverty, and I agree with you, poverty is a very neutral, wishy-washy term, most of the issues that dealt with poverty in the New York Times dealt with black poverty. And they found out, the New York Times had a shock, that they never really went to white, working class or former working class people in Ohio and Michigan and Minnesota who really turned the election to term, because to talk about class sounded old-fashioned, Marxist, and not really stuff. Of course, one doesn't have to go back to dichotomic views of class struggle, that there are only two classes in society. Things are even more complicated, even for Marx himself, when he took a close look at France or Germany or Britain. But one has to understand that one of the reasons which drove people in the United States to Trump, drove people in Britain to Brexit, was the feeling that the traditional left, Democratic Party in the United States, Labour, didn't really care very much for the lower orders of white society. One has to go back and address those issues, because those are issues that have to do with the structures of a globalized economy, where we all know who were the winners, and there were a lot of people who were winners, but there were also a lot of people who were losers, and they were part of the traditional working class or lower middle class, which was the back, really the back elements of left-wing social democracy. And social democracy, which is also now not only in this country, but all over the world under a cloud, has to go back to address structural issues, not of marginal poverty, but the structural issues that have to do with the way in which the world globalized capitalist system works, and to take care of social classes, social groups, not just identity groups here or there on the margin, but the structural issues of 21st century capitalism. Those are different issues from 19th century capitalism, but the issues didn't go away. And the second issue has to do, of course, with the issue of nation. We sometimes find, especially in Israel, people who claim that they are secularists. That's fine. But they forget that French secularists, laïcité, French people, are very French. They relate to French history, from Jeanne d'Arc to Napoleon to and they are not secularists in an abstract sense. They are secularists anchored in a society which believes in secularism. One of the first people who addressed those issues in 1919 was a young Zionist socialist, Chaim Arlozov, born in Russia and Ukraine, grew up in Germany, and was close to Martin Buber and the Hapoel HaTzair, one of the more humanistic socialist Zionist movement. And he wrote a pamphlet in 1919 asking a very tough question for somebody who was at that time 19 years old himself. Before World War I, there was a common view shared not only by socialists or social democrats, but also by people who are not socialists, that there is something called international solidarity, international proletarian solidarity. And international proletarian solidarity was viewed by many people as a guarantee against another war, because it would be inconceivable that French working class people will fight against German working class when for 20 years they were meeting in socialist international, summer groups, etc., etc. The proletarians don't have a homeland. It turned out within less than 2 months that German working class people and French working class people were German patriots and French patriots. And Chaim Arlozov wrote a very moving, a little bit romantic paragraph in which he said that socialists overlooked the fact that even a working class person who may be alienated from the high bourgeois culture of his country loves the language of the lullabies that his mother sang to him, loves the dresses and costumes of his people, loves the valleys and the mountains of his region. I mean, a little bit kitschy if you wish, but that he is anchored in a certain historical context. And this context cannot be just superseded by an abstract universalism, which should, of course, be the horizon of everybody, but cannot be replacing the fact that people are living in a context. And therefore, I'm very glad. I mean, where's your book? I mean, Yuli's book, Why Nationalism? Nationalism, לאומיות, not לאומנות. In Hebrew there's something, this foreigners will not understand what I'm saying. In Hebrew there's something called nun hagnai, like there is vav hipuch, etc. לאומי is okay. לאומני, that's usually the other one. It's bad. Smoli, left is okay. Leftist is a little bit problem. You don't have to add the nun hagnai to Yemani because it is intrinsic. but this is very political. Okay, remember that. We have to re-legitimize the fact that yes, we are members of a people, of a nation, as Mazzini, one of the most cosmopolitan nationalist thinkers of the 19th century, said, that I'm a member of I'm a member of humanity through being a member of my country and my nation. To re-legitimize the moderate universalist values of nationalism, history, culture, which do not deny the other the same rights that you deny for yourself. After all, the reason why liberal and social democratic Zionists in 1947 accepted partition was that if you claim a Jewish right for self-determination, The idea of self-determination is the universalist element, and you cannot claim it for yourself and deny it to the other, which doesn't mean that the term of nationalism should be used as just depicting the enemy. The other doesn't have to be the enemy. The other has to be accepted in his otherness and in the commonality of our being members of the human race, each speaking a different language, have a different history, and trying to reach out to the history and the language and the culture of the other. So both class and nation, which were somehow taken out of the liberal democratic discourse at a terrible price that all of us are paying now, have to be reincorporated in a universalistic, modern, mutualistic way. Again, Mazzini, Arlozorov, Buber are a good example for that.
Thank you, Shlomo. When you spoke about leftist resistance to the war on the eve of 1914, Jean Jaurès, who stood up, was assassinated because of that. And since you mentioned Arlozorov, those who are familiar with Tel Aviv geography remember that the trade union building in Tel Aviv is now between Arlozorov and Jabotinsky. Okay, Yuli, please.
Sorry, drawing on what was said so far, I would really like to endorse the last point Shlomo made, not to overlook the first ones, but the last one, about the national discourse that is based on universal grounds, and for me has always been the reason why I'm a lefty. My commitment to a two-state solution and to the rights of the Palestinian people is grounded exactly in the same ideology that makes me a Zionist. And I always thought that if I'm a Zionist, I'm committed to the rights of other nations, including the Palestinians. So your real choice is between being a nationalist and being a universalist. But if you can't be halfway, or you can't pick and choose and be just your own nationalist while regarding the national desires of other peoples. And I think this is something that as a left-wing group, ideology, parties, we have sort of failed to do. We have failed to declare that openly that we're Zionist, and that's the essence of why we are here. And then that because, not to apologize for supporting the rights of the Palestinians, but to make it the essence of our understanding of our own nationalism. And for too long we have been discussing about how the Arab citizens of Israel are a demographic threat. And we turned them in many ways into something that is not really an essential part of this country. So talking and describing the conflict, also the internal conflict in Israel in different terms, I think is incredibly important right now. We have done something, I think, we've undermined our own position by not holding these values as equal values that we're proud of and that we're going to fight for. And I think this would have also created a better chance for a kind of partnership with the Arab citizens of Israel, who do not only have an identity as citizens, but have a clear national identity. As a Minister of Education, I had this debate about the Nakba. Should we acknowledge the pain of the Palestinians? Leah is here, some of senior members of the ministry are here, they know the fight. And the reason I did it was not because I wanted to undermine our national narrative. I think Canada did it, by the way, very well by apologizing to the Aboriginals, to other groups. When you have the power to acknowledge the other, it means that you feel that you are established and that you can allow yourself to somehow include within your own narrative also the faults of your own history. And for me, this is where strength is demonstrated. So I wholeheartedly endorse the fact that we should talk differently about our relationship with the Arab citizens of Israel and with the Palestinians to make it very clear that this is a national discourse between peoples, grounded in universal values, grounded in mutual respect. There will be conflicts. There won't be an easy solution, but there will be some sort of a structural basis for a dialogue. Now, I wholeheartedly, Michael, agree, and actually I became a real expert in, fighting fights that are worth fighting and then losing them. And I think you're right. This is something that we have a duty, a moral duty, to fight, because we make a statement, and even though, I should say it because I'm sort of one of the veterans, I'm old enough to be a veteran of the struggle for acknowledging the right of the Palestinians, even though the political scene in Israel has moved dramatically to the right, things that are said today couldn't have been said in the 70s, in the Labour Party. I fought with Shlomo about it, I think, in the beginning, when we said, can you remember that in the Labour Party you couldn't say a Palestinian state, you said a Palestinian entity. I hope Trump is not leading us back there. But there were days that this was a real debate in Israel. Golda Meir saying there is no Palestinian people. So we have gone, as I said earlier, we oscillate. We go back and forth and back and forth. In some ways, I think we've gone some distance from where we started. And I want to end with actually the motto of my book that I took from Václav Havel, another fellow traveler who knew a lot about failure. And he writes something so beautiful, and for me, it's something that guides my thinking. And he says, hope is certainly not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. A few remarks on the way Israelis feel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as you refer to the past and the words that were not permitted to say in the past. Basically, I think that when somebody would ask in a survey, in a poll, whether you are left and right, most of Israelis would say right-wing, because this is the bon ton, being right. The meaning is that we are strong and they cannot attack us. And this is also meaning being more Jewish and all this stuff. But then next question, this is the bad news. The good news is that the next question would be, would you accept the idea of two states for two peoples? The answer would be yes. The bad news is that there is no Israeli leader that is willing to do so. Now, talking about our story, I believe that we should take it from universities, from a discussion like this, to the streets, not only by demonstrating, but also by demonstrating each and every citizen why this is important for him or her. Because democracy is not just a system, it's about you, it's about a concern for you, it's about your right to speak, your right to think, it's about your rights. And when the obligation of the government to take care of you, the citizen, and when the government is not doing so, it's your right to go to the Supreme Court and to force the government to do or to act according to your rights. The understanding that it's about you, it gives you something. It's not just a theoretical discussion in the university. And final story is that since I said Liberal of the World Unites, I am part of global or international forums that are talking basically about it and trying to regain our democratic values, to fight for it, and to rewrite the democratic principles in accordance to the realities that are changing in history. So once I was invited to one of these forums, and I was quite proud of myself. It was an international forum by leaders, Madeleine Albright, others, and I felt so proud of myself. So I told my son, who is just graduated Tel Aviv University Law School, and I said, listen, I'm so proud I was invited, and I'm going to write now the basic and the principles of democracy, and we are going to present it in the G7 summit. And he looked at me and he said, why do you think that when you dinosaurs would sit in a room and write something on a piece of paper, this would touch my generation? And I said, wow, what do you mean? Usually, I mean, quite supportive usually. So he showed me in his iPhone, these were the days in which there were demonstrations by youth, by teenagers in the US against the guns. It was after the shootings in schools. And he showed me an American teenager giving a speech, and she was so impressive. And he showed it to me and he said, listen, this is not a problem that we have here in Israel, but I feel connected to this young, basically young leader, the way she speaks, and I have this on my iPhone. What you are going to write in this piece of paper, I don't think that somebody would hear about it. So I went to the States and I joined this gathering, and usually and I shared with them this discussion, this conversation. And they said, firstly, usually when we sit in round tables, our assistants, the young guys, are sitting behind us. So I said, okay, first we need to have also young people on board talking about this. Secondly, we need to think in terms of pictures, Instagram, hashtag. Me too, this huge movement started with a kind of a hashtag. And we need to think in a manner that speaks to young people, to young generation, because otherwise we are going to lose it. So basically, I think that this is my understanding that I take from my young generation, to tell the story and to tell it in a manner that they would understand. Thank you.
Thank you. We can now take a couple of questions from the audience. Professor Shapira. You have a... Yeah. We'll get you a mic.
Thank you. It has been exciting, teaching, moving, and quite depressing. I think that the two specific elements typical to the Israeli situation, bringing our democracy under siege, in addition to the universal trends that were touched upon or explained in depth, were mentioned. Definitely the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict and its ramifications. A little bit, some of you touched upon the religion and state, typical, specific, peculiar Israeli problem. But there's a third problem, typical to us and relevant to our topic, which was not mentioned. And I don't know whether I should tread on a minefield myself by mentioning it. And it is the still existing Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardic rift in the Israeli society with its own cultural and socioeconomic, class, and political, relevant to our topic, ramifications today. And on the side, the question of translation, I think that the Leumani or Leumanut in English could be translated into chauvinist, and chauvinism as distinct from nationalist and nationalism. Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Porat.
Thank you. So my question referred to one point that you, Professor Ignatieff, raised, but I think that also other speakers on the panel referred to, which is, it seems to be kind of a terminological, it seems to be maybe a terminological issue, but I think it's a deeper than that, which is the phrase that we use, and I think that you use too, something similar to that, which is using democracy to depress or to oppress democracy. Now, actually, this is misleading because it's not really using democracy, right? It's using some superficial notion which is associated, in the popular community as a democracy, right? So it's not exactly using democracy to defeat democracy. Now, this terminology could be even detrimental in a way because it gives the impression that there is a tension between two notions of democracy, and we see it also in Israel. Some people would say, yeah, majority, and this is democracy, and okay, so there is some tension between one type of democracy and another conception of democracy, but actually there is no any clash here between two concepts of democracy. The first one is, I don't say is nothing to do with democracy, but very superficial vision of democracy. Now, so this is just maybe a terminological issue, but the more, maybe the deeper question is whether you, Professor Ignatieff, or maybe some other speakers on the panel, could you think of a deeper way to understand democracy and nevertheless say that this deeper understanding still in a clash with a democracy on the ground? Right? For example, it's well known that there is there are studies showing that there is an inverse correlation between having a liberal constitution and what's happening on the ground. Right? We know that in some totalitarian countries, the constitution, you read the constitution and you think, wow, this is fantastic. And once you look at the ground, you see terrible things. It sometimes might be even associated with the idea from another field, which is between formal equality and substantive equality and a similar way. So I wonder what you think about that, right? So we could think, democracy, according to your definition, even, with independent courts, independent universities, and so on. And once you look on the ground, you see something that you really do not consider as full democracy, right? You still see some classes of people which are discriminated. Theoretically, they could go to court, but in fact, they would never go to court, and so on. So this is my question.
I think you're raising very deep questions about the identity of democracy itself. And for my money, I think there is an ongoing permanent tension, which Shlomo Avineri evoked when he talked about the history of 19th century democracy, a permanent, ongoing, but very productive tension at the heart of democracy between popular sovereignty and constitutional freedom. I just think constitutions, courts, the media are there to be counter-majoritarian. The conflict between majoritarian principles and counter-majoritarian principles in democracy is just it's baked into the cake. If you don't have both, you don't have democracy, but the tension between them is intrinsic. I think the second thing you point out is that there's a huge gap, and I think it comes up through what Yuli Tamir was saying as well. There's a huge gap between what a democracy promises, just in the realm of access to constitutional freedoms, and what it delivers. I mean, I was in South Africa, and I've written a chapter of a book about it, in which the grotesque, tragic gulf between what the world's greatest liberal constitution promises and what you get in a shack outside of Pretoria makes you want to cry. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me, the gulf between the promise and the reality. But let's be honest with ourselves, the gulf between the promise and the reality in my country, Canada. I mean, everybody knows Canada's a perfect country, but hey, we've got a terrible gulf. And I think that the only thing I would say in defense of these democracies is that these democratic systems make this gulf visible. That is, in a sense, their job, to make it visible and to constantly create expectations that the system doesn't meet. And so the dynamism of democracy and my optimism and my passionate belief in it has to do precisely with this dialectic between formal and real, between what is promised and what is achieved. And that's what keeps the thing going. And that's why we care about it so much. Not because it's perfect, but because it's a system designed to show up its imperfections. And, you know.
Thank you. It's we're coming to the end of the session. We have a timetable to respect. It is apt that the last question was asked by the fresh president of Tel Aviv University, and that the session is attended by the fresh recent President Yossi Klafter, who ended his term yesterday, and Professor Porat was formally elected today. Formally speaking, the Dan David Prize is an international prize headquartered at Tel Aviv University, has a very firm relationship with the university, and part of that relationship is the fact that the laureates participate in symposia and panels and other activities together with university departments. This panel was organized in cooperation with the Dani Abraham Center for International Studies at Tel Aviv University. It is headed by Professor Anan Ryan, who is also a vice president of the university, and it is my honor to invite Professor Anan to make the concluding statement.
Thank you very much, Itamar. I was given this task about an hour ago, so I'll be very brief. As we all heard, it seems that democracy is going through its worst crisis since the 1930s, and if we take a look at the international scene, we see that the number of countries that we can characterize or describe as democracies is constantly shrinking. The term or concept of populism came up again and again during the presentations. Populism does not have to be xenophobic or anti-immigrants or this kind of extreme right-wing expression. In fact, populism is one of the vaguest concepts in the modern political lexicon. Those of us who have worked on Latin America, for example, know about populist movements who have been very inclusive in nature and tried to incorporate into the political system groups which were on the margins of this system. However, all populist leaders share several traits. One of them is precisely, as you said, a kind of a Manichaean discourse between the utmost good and the utmost evil. And yes, presenting themselves as the speakers on behalf of the people, although they represent only part of the people. And those who are not with us are our enemies. We represent the patria, they represent the anti-patria. You also mentioned the fact that many of the current extreme right-wing politicians of Europe publicly support Israel. There are several reasons for this attitude, in part because the European left and progressive left has criticized Israel in very harsh terms due to its policies in the West Bank. So becoming pro-Israel is now a kind of a political marker for people on the right. At the same time, there are worrying similarities between these Orban, Salvini, and others, and the leading Israeli politician nowadays. And we face similar challenges. Our democratic institutions are under attack as well. So in this Kulturkampf that we are seeing here in Israel, universities in general, and certainly Tel Aviv University in particular, have a role to play. We have three presidents of Tel Aviv University here, Itamar, Rabinovich, Yossi Klafter, Ariel Porat. I think that for all of us, Tel Aviv University is not just a leading research institution. It's not just a hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. It's also a university which highlights the values of pluralism and tolerance and solidarity. And this is a message that we try to convey, to share with our students, but also with the community around us. So in this sense, this symposium is part of our effort to make sure that Israel, for the next generation, is also a democratic country. Thank you so much.